Welcome back, everyone. To start off the second half of the conference, we have Associate Professor Vincent Chua, who is an Associate Professor of Sociology at NUS. Prof. Chua will speak on how disagreements are affected by people's social networks. Prof. Chua, please.
Okay, thank you. All right, I share my screen? Okay, can you see this?
Yes, we can see.
Okay, so, good afternoon, everyone. Special thanks to BSI and to Professor David Chan for inviting me to share my thoughts on these agreements. Actually, a lot of my research focuses on the other side, the value of relationships, that relationships bring to people, how they build communities, and so on. However, it is also true that relationships do often entail a bit of conflict. And disagreements, when taken in the right spirit, can often make relationships even stronger. So this is my attempt at connecting the dots, and I hope you find it useful. Now, my argument, if you will, is basically this, that the opinions that we form, and thereby the agreements and disagreements that we have something to do with our embeddedness in social networks. Now, in speaking with others, we tend to caveat our conversations with words like, "This is my personal opinion," right? But this is actually a misnomer because, in a sense, opinions are never personal, but social. We do not form opinions in a vacuum. Rather, they arise from our interactions with others. Our viewpoints are therefore relational, shaped and filtered by our social networks. Now, in a sense, the self-made man is a myth. We are embedded and enmeshed in social relationships to family, friends, colleagues, neighbors, acquaintances, and these relationships do influence us, right? We emulate others, we follow their ways, consciously or not, we make comparisons, and we do measure ourselves, sometimes incessantly, against others. We are enamored, especially by the views of people that we respect. And actually, organizations do that too. They emulate other organizations and benchmark themselves against them. At different levels of society, we see a tendency towards isomorphism, the copy and pasting of pre-existing traditions, templates, methods, and standards. And of course, along the way, we adjust our practices and beliefs, but not without the inputs of others, right? We listen to the social commentary that is around us, and their opinions do shape our own opinions. Now, in a nutshell, therefore, what I want to say is really this, that we see things not as they are, but as who we are and as who we know, right? So our perceptions and our attitudes are very much shaped by our social networks, and our perceptions are therefore very much network mediated. Our opinions are invariably tied and bound up with network foundations. But this is the catch, of course, because opinions are social, having a diverse network can translate to having a more diverse set of opinions. The implication is clear. If we want a rich diversity of views, we ought to have a rich diversity of social networks. Now, as we go along in life, we learn something from everyone, taking a bit here, a bit there, putting together a repertoire of different ideas and experiences. We become, to use Peterson and Kern, cultural omnivores, partaking of different views and being enriched by them. Our perspectives widen as a result of our diverse relationships. Now, what about media, right? The role of media as a source of influence. Granted, impersonal forces such as media and advertising do influence consumer attitudes and behaviors, but a person is especially likely to buy a product when his friends are also buying it, right? We see what others are doing and we follow suit. Another example would, of course, be vaccination for seniors, right? How do we shape attitudes? Social networks have a role. Recommend a senior and get a $30 e-voucher, right? So friends and family nudge seniors towards being vaccinated. Therefore, the natural units of analysis for attitudes and opinions are not isolated individuals, but in fact, social networks. We are social beings who form opinions based on our social attachments. Now, if our opinions are network mediated, then it begs the burning question. And the question is really this: what kinds of networks lead to agreements and disagreements? Generally, we tend to agree with those we are strongly connected to, right? Strong ties lead to agreement between network members, and people are most likely to compare with and come to agree with others to whom they are most strongly tied. Therefore, mixing with others like yourself reinforces your views, giving rise to the infamous groupthink. Strong ties and the cliques that arise will often mean more of the same information, the same ideas, the same solutions being circulated in the same close-knit groups and networks. The networks, as it were, are therefore then cut from the same cloth, and friends become like one another. They speak the same language, are interested in the same things, make similar judgments, and so on. Strong ties produce camaraderie and mutual support, but what results is actually a less resilient system. Why? Because there's not enough social diversity as well as insufficient diversity of views. Strong ties circulate and reinforce, whilst weak ties transmit and channel possibilities. Now, diversity makes a system more resilient and adaptable to changes in the environment, and blending therefore produces a great amount of innovation. Now, in fact, a society made up of strong ties can be dangerous because the circles have no bridges to connect them. And it is true that weak ties can lead to more disagreements between parties because we perceive them to be different from us. But a society without weak ties or disagreements cannot progress because the islands are not talking to each other. There's little social mixing, little debate, and fewer opportunities for sharpening of ideas. The network sociologist Mark Granovetter says this, that strong ties breed local cohesion, but lead to overall fragmentation. Herein then lies the paradox. Weak ties are actually strong because they have the potential to connect the whole of society. Weak ties are valuable precisely because they span boundaries and connect large chunks of social structure to make a society. Now, that said, crossing bridges does require some special efforts and commitment, and we must be willing to disagree, or at least to agree to disagree, right? So truth be told, disagreements and differences are to be expected, but it does matter how we interpret those differences. One sees it as a threat, another sees it as an opportunity for understanding. Acceptance doesn't mean having to agree on every point, but it means agreeing that there's something bigger that we both treasure. Now, mixing differences can go one of two ways. It can either reduce or increase conflict. One view, the contact hypothesis, says that social mixing confronts and reduces prejudice and increases understanding between groups. The other view, the threat hypothesis, says that social mixing can turn out to increase conflict instead. Here, newcomers are perceived as competition in the eyes of established groups who feel threatened by the new groups on the scene. Under the threat hypothesis, differences can also come in the form of norm and cultural differences that can create misunderstandings between groups. As for which way it goes, I suppose the answer greatly depends on the conditions under which it takes place. For example, a multicultural framework entails the preservation of groups, the celebration of differences, but also inspires exchanges between them. A single culture framework, on the other hand, promotes assimilation, which can actually work against the integration of groups. Now, let me end with this by sharing two studies. And the question that I'm interested to answer is, of course, this: which of the two perspectives prevails in Singapore? Has social mixing increased or has it decreased social cohesion in this country? To adjudicate, I look at two studies, right? So the first one is the Social Capital in Singapore study, comprising 3,000 respondents with links to some 17,000 ties, as well as the Making Identity Count in Asia study, which measures Singaporean values, networks, and feelings of closeness to Singapore. Now, the first study shows a healthy amount of social mixing across the lines of gender, race, religion, and nationality. But the lowest scores are with respect to class, right? Here we see that cliques are forming along the lines of elite schooling as well as private housing, which then of course begs the question, why are class tribalisms so persistent in the first place? I think there might be three reasons. Okay, and let me just quickly list down what they are. The first is homophily, birds of a feather flock together. So we tend to stay within our own social circles and comfort zones. It is the path of least resistance. The second is social structure. Organizations sort, for example, schools. They sort students according to abilities, according to their grades, and so on. There's tracking, the result of which is that schools have specific compositions and student enrollments. There are path dependencies between brand name affiliated schools, from primary to secondary to junior college. The network follows from one stage of schooling to the next, and you have old boy and old girl networks, which strengthen class segregation, and marriage also occurs along class lines. Now, the third reason is inequality. Social mixing between classes entails inherently a resource differential by definition, right? So there are two kinds of barriers here, a basic group difference, as well as a group differential. Social mixing is made harder because the relationship is hierarchical, and the relationship is then essentially unequal. There's a power differential that needs to be bridged. Indeed, the lack of social mixing is both a cause as well as a reflection of inequality. Now, the study shows quite clearly that relationships do matter greatly in how we feel about the nation. In particular, network diversities promote feelings of national cohesion. Now, why is this so? I think the logic is quite intuitive. It is relationships that build a nation. It is only by connecting people from different parts of the social structure that national unity becomes a lived reality. The second study is the identity study, and the results are in fact similar to the first, and that which is that social mixing increases social cohesion. The results show that attributes matter: gender, race, education, and age. Values do also matter, right? The more people subscribe to values of multiculturalism, meritocracy, tolerance, family, respect for the law, the closer their feelings to Singapore become. But what's important here is that network diversity also matters. Having ties to people from different ethnic groups turns out to be positively correlated with feelings of closeness to Singapore. So it is not just our shared values that coheres us as a nation, but in fact our shared relationships that then brings us together as a country. Now, in conclusion, our opinions are not personal, but network mediated, and the strong ties that we have create fewer disagreements within their groups. But the upshot is that they compromise on the broader social cohesion. When ties are too strong and groups become cliques or tribes, a fragmented society results. What we need instead is then to supplement our strong ties with weak ties, boundary spending ties. But the question inevitably arises, is it so simple to just say mix and get along? I mean, there are differences in values, we have differences in wealth and status, hierarchies exist, power and asymmetries are real, of course. I think this morning's panels have made it very clear. Now, differences are hard enough to bridge. What more inequalities? Right? Even historical legacies, things in the past that blend into the present, past hurts or traumas cannot be swept under the carpet, as it were. And the last thing we would want to do, of course, is to downplay the differences, neither to draw disproportionate attention to them. So what we need, I would venture, are middle path strategies. Okay, agreement on common goals, brokers who are skillful mediators, super connectors who do the work of bridging, and translators who are conversant in different domain languages, as well as a heightened sensitivity among powerful groups towards the situations of less powerful groups. At the policy level, we need to ensure open pathways for all, including pathways of social mobility and inclusion. In all this, we should recognize that it is a work in progress, that the journey is iterative and processual. Genuine efforts will not generate integration overnight, but will increase our chances of a more cohesive society over time. With every positive step, one tie at a time, the probabilities of cohesion increase, and the net gain will be a stronger society for all. I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you, Prof. Chua, for your informative presentation. Our next speaker is Associate Professor Cheng, who is an Associate Professor of Psychology at SNU. Prof. Cheng will share with us on the research concerning social identities in the context of dealing with disagreements. Prof. Cheng, please.
Hello, everyone. Thanks to Professor David Cheng and also BSI for having me today. Let me share my screen. Okay. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay. All right. So this morning, we actually learned a lot about disagreement. And also thanks to Professor Vincent Chua's sharing just now, that I'm also going to add on to the positive side of disagreement. So I'm going to share my research and also my ideas about how actually there could be some possibilities coming from disagreement, maybe drawing upon diversity and also social identity. So just to recap, we know that disagreement could happen when there is lack of consensus or approval, or when there is an argument or situation in which people do not have the same opinion. However, the most important question is disagreement is always a bad thing. Actually, from today's discussion in earlier panels, we know that the answer is no, not necessarily. And actually, we can agree to disagree. And the most important goal is to generate constructive disagreement, which means that we are able to generate some good outcomes out of disagreement. And what could be the key? The key could be trying to reap the benefit of diversity. So what is diversity? I would argue that the diversity is the condition of having a thing composed of different elements. And when it comes to diversity in social context, usually we're talking about a group of people who differ in terms of nationality, gender, ethnicity, religious, or socioeconomic status. In other words, we're talking about a group of people with different social identities. And chances are, because of that, they might have very different perspectives and also opinions. So what could be the potential outcomes of diversity? Well, the general negative outcomes is what we just talked a lot today, and that could be disagreements out of different opinions and also perspectives, possibly coming from different social identities. And even worse, that could contribute to tensions and also maybe conflicts among people who come from different social groups. However, if we are able to integrate the different perspectives from the different social identity groups and trying to turn them into an integrated perspective, we are actually able to generate some positives out of diversity. So research shows that actually when we are able to integrate different perspectives and also different ideas from the group members who come from very different backgrounds, we are actually able to introduce the increase the productivity or increase the cultural awareness and also insights and even better creativity in the group, which is highly desirable. So let's take a closer look at the major element of diversity, social identity. When we talk about social identity, we're talking about actually aspect of our self-concept that actually derive from membership in our association with specific groups. And chances are, when we belong to a specific group, we don't just having the membership, we are also have a strong sense of belongingness to that specific group. And because of these kind of special ties with the social group, we also acquire knowledge and also expertise on this specific social identity. In other words, we actually gain insiders advantage out of our social identity. But the truth is we all have multiple social identities, and chances are different ones might be salient in different occasions. Using myself as an example, I'm a psychologist, I'm a member, faculty member from school, from SMU, and also I'm a woman. But right now, in terms of the most salient social identity at the moment would be me being a psychologist, because I'm going to share with you my research. So different identity might be salient in different conditions. So we just talked about diversity within group, or I can frame it in a different way. I would call it an interpersonal diversity, such as people belong to different social groups, and therefore they possess different social identities. I would argue that chances are we can also spot diversity within ourselves, and I label it as intrapersonal diversity. What does that mean? That means that different people, including myself, might have a different set of multiple social identities with us. And depending on how we manage our multiple social identities that contribute to our intrapersonal diversity. So here the key question is that when people harness the benefit of diversity by overcoming potential tensions and conflicts between different social groups or members from different social groups, what would happen to individuals with multiple social identities that might not be compatible within ourselves? Allow me to use two examples to illustrate what could happen in terms of us having maybe similarly in conflict social identities simultaneously. The first one would be Asian Americans who have two cultural identities. We all know that Asian culture is very different from American culture in terms of different cultural values, different cultural norms, and also different behavioral expectations. So being an Asian American might have to deal with potential clash between the two different cultural identities they have because of the very different perspective, expectations and also ideals from the two cultures. Similarly, even more profoundly, we can also see somebody who might have two different self-identities. When we argue that every single one of us have self-identity, but the truth is self-identity can be largely shaped by our culture. For example, we all know that some of us coming from individualist culture, whereas others come from collectivistic cultures, but these two types of culture actually provide very different view about the self. For example, independent view versus interdependent view. And let me give you an example about how this could contribute to very different aspirations. Usually what we see from an independent view of the self is that they would pursue personal uniqueness, trying to sort of express their opinions and trying to be consistent about themselves. But if a person endorses more of an interdependent view of the self, maybe the major goal for them is to trying to fit into the situations and try to fit into the group and trying to maintain group harmony as much as possible. Imagine a person who might possess both these two self-identities simultaneously. How are they going to balance between the potential clash between the two? So the truth is that chances are we might have social identities that might to some extent clashing or in conflict with one another inside ourselves. So remember, we talked about how to reap the benefit of diversity within the group. Actually, we might apply the same ideas to reaping the benefit of intra-personal diversity. So for example, chances are we might have different experiences, expertise, and also understanding associated with each of our different social identities. However, what if we think that these two social identities are not compatible and we try not to bring them together? Are we still able to reap the benefit out of it? In other words, actually, identity integration among different social identities might be important. And this is actually true according to my colleagues and my research. What we found is that when people have different social identities and when they face challenges in terms of bringing the two similarly in conflict identities together, we see individual difference. And we sort of utilize this contrast identity integration to capture such type of individual differences. We are able to picture it as a spectrum. So on the one side of the spectrum, for this group of people, we label them as high identity integrators. They strongly identify with the two social groups. But in the meantime, they are able to perceive the two identities as compatible and also complementary. So they're able to associate themselves with both groups at the same time and even being both simultaneously at the same time. In comparison, on the other side of the spectrum, we see this group of people as low identity integrators. The truth is they are also strongly identifying with the two social groups. However, they constantly feel caught between the two social identities. So how they manage these two social identities would be trying to separate them in different time and trying to endorse one at one time, but not both at the same time. So when people have these kind of individual differences when dealing with their dual social identities, what would happen to them in terms of the social outcomes? I'm going to use two lines of my research to shed some light. The first one is again about Asian Americans. American proverb says, squeaky wheels gets the grease, which emphasizing the importance of standing out. But the Chinese proverb taught us that the bows that bear most actually head down, right? So how would Asian Americans deal with such very different teachings from the two cultures? Well, going back to the ideas about identity integration, we do see individual differences among Asian Americans who integrate their Asian and American identities into different levels. So we label them as high BIIs versus low BIIs. And according to my colleagues in my research, we found that actually high BIIs have larger social network and also are connected with more outgroup members than low BIIs. In other words, actually, Asian Americans with high BII, they are more inclusive and also they're more open to people who are different from them. In addition, we also see that high BIs actually exhibit less intergroup bias than low BIs. In other words, high BIs are able to treat their in-group and out-groups more equally than those who have low BIs. Last but not the least, we see that high BIs actually is higher creativity than low BIs, especially when the task requires them to apply both knowledge from their dual cultural identities. In other words, actually when low BIs also have the same amount of cultural knowledge as much as high BIs, but high BIs are more able to bring them together in order to generate new solutions and also new ideas from the two cultural knowledge sets than low BIs. Let's move on to the second example. The second example is about Singaporeans. I believe all of us might have these two feelings from time to time. The first one is I value freedom, and the second is but we value relationship. As I mentioned earlier, our self-views are actually largely shaped by our culture. So we know that actually a dominant Western view can be labeled as independent view of the self. So people pursue their independence, their autonomy, and also the expression of their internal attributes and also pursuing internal consistency about themselves. But we also know that actually there is a very different view from the Asian cultures about the self. And we label it as interdependent view of the self. And usually when people endorse this kind of self-view, they tend to define self in relationship and also in specific cultural context or social context. In other words, because of that, their self is not fixed. They would be malleable and also more fluid in terms of how they should perceive themselves. And they would try to pursue harmony and also better relationship between them and also the social context in order to better fit in. So we can see that actually the two different views are very different and sometimes they can clash. Now let's move on to paying attention to Singaporeans. We all know that Singaporeans are Southeast Asians, but with great exposure to Western cultures. In this case, what would happen to Singaporeans' self-view? According to my research, I found that actually most of the Singaporeans actually have both sides of self, which means that they both endorse Western and also Asian views at the same time. But the issue is that chances are these two self-views might clash. One example from my college students is that when they need to decide what would be their pursuit of their future career, they would wonder, should they follow their own heart or should they listen to their parents? I think we also have this discussion in the earlier panel this morning. So again, we see individual differences in terms of how Singaporeans deal with these two sides of the self. So I came up with this construct called dual self-construct integration to capture the individual differences, or DISCI. So what I found is that for Singaporeans who have high DISCI, those are people who can reconcile the difference between the two self-constructs and they're trying to see the two as compatible. In comparison, for those who have too low DISCI, they would not be able to reconcile the differences so well between the two self-constructs, and they see these two as in conflict. They still have these two sides. So what they do is that they will utilize different sides in different social contexts, but not trying to bring them together. What would be the implication? Today we're talking about disagreement and also we talk about conflict. And we all know that actually dealing with all kinds of conflicts is actually a normal part of our social life. So because of that, research shows that there are different conflict resolution styles. And one commonly used framework is the dual concerns framework. And in this framework, we use 2 dimensions to talk about 5 different strategies. The first dimension is to what extent you would have concern about your own outcomes, high or low. And the second dimension is to what extent you would have concerns about your counterpart or your partner's outcomes in this conflict, again, high or low. So out of different combinations versus high or low, in terms of high or low on each of the dimensions, we can generate 5 different styles, as what I show in the figure on the right-hand side. Among the 5, actually, the collaborative conflict resolution style is considered the most ideal, because for this one, it represents high concern for your own needs and also high concern for your counterpart's needs. In other words, in terms of this kind of conflict resolution style, we're striving to get a win-win solution in order to fulfill both parties' needs and wants. And what I found in terms of Singaporeans, DSCI and their conflict resolution style is that I found those with high DSCI, they tend to endorse collaborative conflict resolution styles much more than those with low DSCI. In other words, those with high DSCI, they actually strive to fulfill both their own needs and also their counterparts' needs more than low DSCI. And in order to make this happen, actually, they believe that this is possible. So they will strive to make it happen. And because of the endorsement of this win-win solution, I also found that those with high DSCI tend to have higher self-esteem, also higher self-concept clarity, which means that they know better about who they are. And also they have higher subjective well-being. Okay, so after learning about the positives about having a high integration between your multiple social identities, what can we do? I would say that in individual level, first of all, we need to be open-minded and trying to tolerate differences and conflicts that arising from our multiple social identities. And then maybe one useful strategy would be trying to focus on positive experiences about having dual social identities. My research shows that merely by recalling positive experiences about having multiple social identities can facilitate a person's level of identity integration momentarily, which means that actually when you realize the benefits and also the positive outcomes, we will be able to integrate our identity to a greater level to some extent. Now, how to incubate identity integration in the social context? Actually, what we found so far is that the intrapersonal diversity, such as cultural identity integration, is actually a proximal mirror reflection of the perceived peaceful or conflictual diversity one feels with regards to the extent of diversity that he or she is exposed to interpersonally. In other words, how we sort of map onto our own identity integration is actually what we learn from the social relations between the social groups we are associated with. So that goes to my recommendations for how we can enhancing identity integration in the societal level. Because I just mentioned that intrapersonal identity integration is a mere reflection of the interpersonal relationship. So one thing we can do in the societal level would be trying to facilitate perceived compatibility and harmony between different social groups. And one potential strategy would be utilizing high identity integration individuals as ambassadors for bridging different social groups. Because this group of people, they have to fit standing in different social groups, and they know very well about the differences. They even generate good strategies to bring these two things together. So they might be able to become very good translators in terms of speaking two social languages with the two social groups and facilitate the communication or even collaboration between the two social groups. So I believe that this might be one potential strategy that we can think about. So in short, I think in the societal level, what we can do is to start from adopting the agree to disagree strategy for our conversation, and then trying to reap the benefits of the diversity, knowing that actually being different is not a bad thing, and we are able to generate something good out of it. And eventually we will be able to strive for a collaborative resolution in order to create a win-win solution for everybody. With this, I end my sharing today. Thank you.
Thank you, Prof. Cheng, for the interesting perspective on social identities and disagreements. We will now have the panel discussion with Prof. Chua and Prof. Cheng, and our moderator is Dr. Mathews. Dr. Mathews is Principal Research Fellow and Head of the Social Lab at the Institute of Policy Studies at NUS. Again, if you'd like to raise a question, please type in your question in the Q&A box. Over to you, Dr. Mathews.
Thank you very much. I'm sure all of you have enjoyed the two presentations by Professor Vincent and Professor Cheng. I think they're a very, very helpful way of understanding it. I mean, the whole issue about disagreements, or at least the broader aspects of it from perhaps the more sociological and psychological perspective. I mean, Vincent did remind us about the fact that a lot of opinions are actually based in our social networks, and that has an important part in shaping us, in shaping some of our conversations and discussion. And Cheng, thanks for sharing on that, on social identities and how that precipitates disagreements. But again, you did remind us about the value of integrating, so integrating different perspectives. And of course, you did talk about the high DSCI, and I'm sure that quite a few people want to know a little bit more about that and how that can actually bring about productivity and creativity. So I think it's very, very useful ideas that we can start off with. I'm looking for a set of questions. I'm sure people are raising questions, and I see some from my colleague Mike. But let me just first start with some very broad ones. And I thought maybe both Vincent and Ying, you can kind of talk about this, because at some point I did hear this part coming out. I think, Vincent, you mentioned this idea about finding the middle path. Don't downplay differences, but at the same time, don't put too much attention to it. Well, essentially, I mean, I think the big question that we ask when we try to find the middle path is whether there will be an issue where people start defining which discussions should get attention, because there is essentially a power dynamic at play there. Cheng, at the same time, I think carrying on that thought, we have this idea about social identities, and the fact that social identities can be the starting point where people begin to have the sense of disagreement. And again, you've talked about this whole important thing about reconciling those differences that come with that. So again, there is, what aspect, I mean, when people make those choices about the particular identity to choose, will there be a hierarchy of those, and will that come into some kind of contestation? Just very broad questions, and I just would like to hear any thoughts that come with that.
Thanks, Mathew. Should I venture first?
Yes, go ahead, please.
Okay, I think that, it's difficult enough to meld circles, different cultures, but perhaps it's even more difficult to meld hierarchies. When there's inequality, when there's a power differential, and so on. But to your question about the middle path, I think I will say this, that very often when we have a discussion and so on, and competing views and things of that nature, I think the temptation is always to see it in terms of a zero-sum game, right? Are you for or against? And then the implication is, of course, that at the end of the discussion, however long it is, there would emerge a winner, and by implication, of course, then a loser. But actually, when you think about disagreements and even how people, flesh out their debates and so on, there are actually three possibilities, right? You have right and wrong, right? So one person is right in a sense, and the other person is wrong. You also have the possibility that both are wrong. You also have the possibility that both are right. Right, so I think rather than look at it in a polarized fashion, yes versus no, could actually anticipate the possibility that both may be right or both may be wrong, just as much as one may be right and one may be wrong, if it comes to that. Yeah, so that's part of what I mean by taking a middle path, not to take an adversarial, confrontational approach to discussion, right, but rather to see how a middle ground may be struck between the two parties.
Thanks, Vincent. Cheng, any thoughts
Okay, actually, I can add to what Vincent just shared, because I totally agree with what Vincent mentioned in terms of sometimes when we talk about social identity or social groups, we start to divide between you and me, or they and us. And based on this kind of mindset, we start to have these zero-sum games, such as either you win, I lose, or I win, you lose. But going back to the collaborative conflict resolution style, actually, what's possible is that we could create a win-win solution. And going back to Mathew's earlier questions in terms of when we have so many social identities, which one to choose, right? The interesting thing is that usually when we are situated in a social context, sometimes one of our social identity is primed without our awareness. And we start to take actions being guided by that specific social identity. And maybe at that point, we start to generate this kind of me, them, and a me, you, or us, them type of mindset. And Mathew, your question is exactly a perfect answer, because actually we have multiple social identities. If we are able to be aware of the fact, chances are we will be able to see that there are common grounds between you and me, and between we and them, in terms of we also have another shared social identities that can integrate us. And starting from there, we can start to sit down to review the potential differences between the different social identities we have, and start to together to talk about what can be a potential middle ground, or an even better integrative perspective that we can both live with or even feel happy about it. So I think that could be one potential approach to deal with the multiple social identities, and also turning a fixed game into a win-win solution.
Thanks, Cheng. Yeah, so this idea about, individuals being able to integrate, both their identities, their perspectives in a kind of seamless way. I think some way Vincent was, arguing perhaps that social mixing does make that possible, or provide some levers by which people are able to have a better hang on other identities or other perspectives. But I think at the same time, I think we've got a question here. Social mixing can be beneficial, but people differ in the extent to which they proactively care to expand their social networks. So some people, for instance, prefer to keep it to their own closed social networks, while others prefer to maintain a more diverse network. So this falls into the level of individual preferences. Now, the questioner asked, is there a role for others, perhaps the community, perhaps the state, in kind of encouraging social mixing? And will that have any kind of dividend?
Thanks, Mathew. I think there is an interplay, or rather an interaction between choice and opportunity, right? We make different choices and so on based on things like our personality and so on. But since the question is asking about the state, then I think it may be useful to think about this in terms of opportunities, right? I would say that social mixing, the presence or the lack of it, is really tied to the opportunity structure. Yeah. So as for what the state can do, my study shows that there are different platforms and domains that do facilitate this, right? So arts and culture is one. Yeah. Sports is another. Yeah. Workplaces certainly do bring people of different backgrounds together, especially locals and foreigners. So workplaces would be one domain. Schools is interesting. Schools used to do a very good job in bringing people of different class backgrounds together. 1950s, 60s, it was the finest, meritocracy's finest hour in a sense, right? Schools like RI was able to bring students of different class backgrounds together. And then the social mixing then went down after that, right? And then now it's sort of going up again, hopefully with policies like SBD, right? Subject-based banding and so on. Then the social mixing would go up. Yeah, but the research actually shows that, particularly the cohorts that were born between 1982 and 1995, And then, of course, then 12 years later, they did their PSLE, right? So they did their PSLE in 1994, 2007. That cohort saw a dip in their class social mixing. And that is also the cohort, if you recall, that there was a lot of, there was a lot of competition that was going on in terms of the school rankings and so on, right? So, and then in 2012, they stopped that, right? And then now we are looking at other strategies to increase social mixing again, right? So the amounts of social mixing varies in tandem with changes in opportunity structure, right? And it's not just a matter of personal choice or preferences. A national service is a very good platform for the integration of classes. We found that to be the case. Neighborhoods to some extent.
But Vincent, if I can just push you a little bit about this one. So if you're not able to have all those spaces for people to really get engaged in social mixing, would there still be a way that, for instance, classes, or people of different groups would be able to work out disagreements and come out, despite the fact that, they might not have that kind of mixing? Is there still that possibility they'll be able to come to some kind of consensus instead of dealing with disagreements in a very adversarial fashion?
Opportunities for mixing are structural, right? It is very hard for people from two separate groups that don't ever meet to come together to resolve issues, right? So choices matter, preferences matter, how people negotiate differences matter, how the discussion evolves matters. But I think first and foremost, what undergirds this is that the opportunity structure must provide the possibility of parties coming together in the first place.
Thanks, Vincent. So if we move to Cheng. So Cheng, if in terms of, if it would be a policy recommendation, one of the things would be that you need these high identity integrators because they're able to bridge the different groups of people. So even if we don't have pervasive social mixing in society, what I can hear from you is that if we have some of these people within society, we should be able to quell some of the disagreements or be able to come up with some kind of compromise situation. That's roughly what I'm hearing. So of course, and then the big question comes out, okay, one, from a very practical point of view, so, can we train such individuals? Are they associated with particular demographic types? Would we find more high identity integrators among people who have got lots of advanced education, for instance? So how do we identify that from a very practical point of view? Will that kind of be the answer to Vincent's call for social mixing? Can we do without worrying about social mixing, but just have lots of people with this particular property or characteristic?
Thanks for Mathew for this great question. Well, yes, indeed. In order to utilize a group of high identity integrators as the so-called ambassadors to facilitate inter-social group relationships, we need to identify them to begin with, right? To be honest, in terms of generating a group of high identity integration individuals, there are two folds, as I mentioned. There are individual aspects and also the societal aspects. So from the existing identity integration research, we found that just like what you talk about, that there are individual preferences, right? And we also see individual differences in terms of who might have higher chance to become high identity integrators. And according to all kinds of identity integration research, we found that chances are that would be related to their personality traits. So what we found is that for those who are more extroverted and also who have higher emotional stability, chances are they have a higher chance to become a high identity integrators. But I think even more important than talking about the personality traits is that we can imagine why would this group of people become having better chance to become high identity integrators. I don't think they were born to be high identity integrators. I think that's because when they have this kind of personality traits, they might be more open to their challenging experiences in terms of dealing with these kind of cultural differences. And they're not that easy to be threatened because they have higher emotional stability when dealing with the potential clash from this kind of cultural experiences. So if we base on this argument to think about the societal level of issues, actually that goes back to the harmonious relationship between different social groups. So in the current research on identity integration, we saw that in cities or societies that have higher cultural harmony, actually we are able to produce more high identity integrators. So there are two folds. So we can either start from trying to prepare a group of people who might be more ready to manage the challenge between their dual social identities and make them become higher identity integrators, and then facilitate the communication and also teach or coach people from different social groups to talk to each other. In the meantime, I think we also need to prepare the social environment to breed such type of possibility in order to make such type of ideal person to be better able to survive and also being bred in such an environment.
Essentially, you can, I mean, some things about society and its context could shape some of those individuals, if I'm hearing it right.
Exactly, right.
So Vincent, back to you. Any thoughts cross-cut with Cheng?
I think it's very important to, it's not, I think we tend to see it as a matter of either or, right? Too much bridging or too much bonding social capital. I think in fact we need both and not just one or the other, right? Too much mixing, does it produce excesses? Too little mixing, what are the excesses associated with that? I think what we need is actually a combination of both working in tandem.
Yeah, and as you say, I mean, quite a few questions here have got to do with this whole idea about, I mean, since you mentioned this word about mixing and coming together, people are asking questions to do with when, I mean, was there a critical point in which if you try to mix too many people into a same kind of social group identity, then perhaps, I guess, the benefits of being in the group start to fade off, and perhaps that sparks off new levels of disagreement. Questions to do with, I mean, of course, then other issues about how do you, I mean, if you are able to get people to integrate together and come together, then can some of these attitudes, which are positive, can they be sustained, or do they go off? I guess many questions related to the contact theory. People are looking at that. Yeah.
I say maybe two things. The first is that it's not a case that diversity is so important that you then stop building bonding social capital, right? We have families, we have groups, we have our groups and associations that provide a lot of social support and so on. So it's not either or again, but as you are building your bonding social capital, to also build your bridging social capital. And it is the combination of the capital, strong and weak ties, that together make for a resilient system, you see, right? So if you're always bridging and you're not sinking roots or anchoring yourself to a group or community, that may also produce a problem, right? So we need both strong and weak ties really to provide, a resilient sort of network repertoire going forward in life. I'll say the second thing is with regard to the question of sustainability. How do you sustain, the interactions once you've initiated social mixing? How do you carry it through and so on? I would say maybe there are three things to consider. The first one is this: it cannot be a one-off, right? So the interactions have to be routine, right? You have to come together every now and then, even quite often, for there to evolve a common project or so that you're working on. Now, the second ingredient, I suppose, to sustain social mixing is to ensure, where possible, that there isn't competition. You're not coming together to compete on something, right? You are coming together to collaborate, right? So that's the second thing, which of course then relates to my third point, which is shared interests. Okay, the different groups and so on may have different persuasions, may have different backgrounds and so on. But if there may be common interests, right, what might those interests be? So I think we started off with this, the tension between us versus them. I think one possibility is to think in terms of converting us versus them to we, right? From us versus them to a we framework. Thank you.
Thanks. Just follow. Cheng, did you have any thoughts to that?
Yeah, I'd like to add on to what Vincent just shared. According to social psychology research, actually talking about social identity, maybe one way people have thought about in psychology research or among psychology scholars is to create a superordinate social identity, right? Such as we are all Singaporean, as our national identity can be considered a superordinate identity. This is very useful in terms of facilitating harmony among the larger society. However, this might sort of sacrifice the benefits of diversity. Because when people start to focus on the similarity among all of us, we sort of suppress our other social identities that might contribute to different perspectives, different expertise, different experiences. So I want to reiterate what Vincent mentioned in terms of the importance of maybe the weak tie or maybe the importance of social mixing, because we want to preserve these differences and trying to utilize the differences. But of course, we understand that maybe there would be potential costs about potential tensions or conflicts arising from these kind of differences, but we can figure out a way to deal with that. And there is another line of research in psychology called cultural mixing, which is very similar to Vincent's research about social mixing. And in terms of cultural mixing, we also found that when doing right, cultural mixing is very good for creativity, but that can only happen when people are not threatened by my culture being threatened by other people's culture. In other words, we should be very confident and also having a sense of safety, at least psychological safety, in order to embrace the differences. So I think actually in order to make social mixing possible or making cultural mixing possible, making every single group feel that they actually are on the equal stance and their rights and also their free will will be protected properly. And then starting from there, we will be able to initiate proper conversation among the different groups in order to facilitate social mixing. I think that will be something desirable instead of just wiping out the potential differences and pursuing a superordinate social identity.
Alice can give a thought, Cheng, Vincent. I mean, do we have that in our current society now? Do we feel that most groups don't feel threatened? I mean, do we have the ingredients which will allow that kind of mixing where we do feel that we can play on the strengths of diversity, or it could essentially backfire? Just your broad thoughts about where we are as a society.
I'll venture a view, but I will talk about it from the viewpoint of class mixing. I know there are different identities and so on, but the challenge with social mixing on class is, I suppose, that there's a resource differential, right? So you're not just mixing groups, you are in fact trying to mix hierarchies. And how is that even possible in a sense, right? We can't help but look at one another in terms of their worth in market terms, right? So this morning, Tommy spoke about Confucianism, but I want to add to his view by talking about neoliberalism. Neoliberalism is the idea that a person's worth is tied to his market value, what he has achieved, who he knows, the accolades he has garnered, and so on. I think when we look at people in terms of their market value, in terms of their rank and their position and so on, it makes it all the harder to meld hierarchies, right? So I think we need quite a radical mindset shift to look at others not in terms of their market value, the sort of neoliberal sort of approach, but rather to look at one another in terms of our shared humanity, right? And then that hopefully will attenuate some of the class inequality sort of notions that we are sort of so used to looking at. when we focus on our shared humanity, in a sense, actually, even to put aside this meritocratic measurements of, in how we evaluate human worth and dignity, would be necessary to engender a view of the other person, not in terms of what he has achieved, but in terms of who he is. I mean, after all, we are human beings, right? We are not human doings. So the neoliberal slant always focuses on human doings, what they have achieved, and then we rank people accordingly. But if we look at people as human beings, right, the basic human dignity and who they are as persons, their personhood in the fullness, not as economic beings, then I think we have a better chance at melding hierarchies if we can suspend that neoliberal tendency to evaluate people in terms of their market value.
Ying, any thoughts that you have just broadly about whether we have the ingredients for the kind of safety for the kind of mixing we're talking about?
Well, I think from my observation, I think we're heading toward the right direction, but we're not there yet. That reminds me of my other line of research about female professionals working in taking on male-dominated professions, such as female lawyers, female physicians, even female faculty members like me, and also maybe female engineers. Generally speaking, women in STEM pretty much face similar situations, such as when they might actually be equipped with the same professions and also expertise as their male counterparts, but because of the dominant professional culture that is very much male-dominated, women who needs to work there actually, to some extent, have to compromise their gender identity to a great extent. And that also contributes to the discrepancy between their female gender identity and their professional identity. So we also see individual differences in terms of high versus low gender professional identity integrations in this kind of professions. And again, we also saw that for those who have high II would outperform those who have low II. So that, again, going back to my earlier point that do we have the ingredients? I think more and more people are paying attention to such an issue, such as women in STEM. But are we there yet? I don't think we're there yet, because we are still in the process of changing the culture. And in terms of making the culture being able to be changed, both the male and also the female professionals need to adjust their mindset in order to deal with the differences. So, I do think that we do have the ingredients. At least right now, I think we have sufficient awareness of the potential issues at the moment, but we're not there yet in terms of figuring out all the necessary strategies and also pave the way to the endpoint yet. I think we still have a long way to go.
Thanks, Cheng. No, I mean, I think one or two people have asked about, especially I think everybody's trying to get a better handle of the high integrators. And so they're wondering, for instance, if you look at people who are in inter-ethnic marriages, for instance, they seem to be individuals who have those characteristics, people who are, I guess, bicultural individuals. Is that, I mean, are some of these traits more clear among such groups of individuals?
I'll put it this way, that every inter-ethnic marriage brings society closer together, right? Because a tie between two people from different groups forms a link between those groups, right? So structurally, the more inter-ethnic marriages there are, the closer the system comes together. The good news is that, as we know, inter-ethnic marriages are increasing, right, in Singapore. So I think this is a very good development going forward.
Cheng,
well, actually, that reminds me of Mathew, your earlier question, and that is, where can we find high identity integrators, right? I would say that actually, in terms of inter-ethnic marriage, maybe that would be a potential hard for us to generate more high identity integrators if they are able to be successfully managing their cultural differences and also making mutual understanding and also collaboration happen. Having that said, of course, we also see more challenges for this kind of social relations because of very different cultural background, different values potentially, and even different social expectations. Actually, for quite a few of the interethnic couples I see, usually when they are in a romantic relationship, there's no issues at all. But when they have to start to raise kids, different ideas about how to what is considered ideal parenting start to kick in, right? So I do see that they pose new challenges or special challenges for being a bicultural couple or starting to producing bicultural individuals in their own families, such as turning themselves into a bicultural individual and also producing their kids as a second generation biculturals. I see that as great hope if they're able to make the cultural identity integration happen. That will be a perfect place for us to generate high identity integrators for future ambassadors for different social groups.
It's kind of interesting, right? Because as you mentioned that maybe at courtship, they're able to integrate these identities together, I mean, different cultures, ethnicities, religions, even perhaps. But yeah, at some point, despite some of that trait, perhaps they had those traits. When it comes to parenting, for instance, those identity, that bridging becomes more and more difficult. I mean, I guess some are more successful depending on how much integrated you are versus whether you're not. But it's kind of curious because, I mean, individuals do then seemingly start off with that propensity, the ability, and then later on it seems like it, under new conditions, may not be able to use whatever personality, makeup, or ability or negotiate at that stage.
Mm.
I guess it suggests that social mixing doesn't just happen, right? It's a continuous work in progress.
Right.
You may hit it off easily at first, but then, I mean, not just interethnic marriage, any marriage, right, requires a constant work in progress. So I think it doesn't just happen. Yeah.
To add on to Vincent's point, I think in terms of the different stages of the marriage, when we start to see the easier or more challenging task that we need to deal with in terms of bridging cultural differences, I guess that is actually a demonstration of how strong and also how fundamental our cultural assumption might influence us. Maybe for some of the aspects, we are more aware of it and we can sort of change it or adjust it by our learning experiences. But for other aspects, when we are not aware of it, maybe we are more influenced by our cultural background, much more than we can be aware of. So maybe that's the reason why for some specific tasks, we see that as more challenging than other tasks. And I think that speaks to the importance of awareness of how your culture and also your social identity or your cultural background actually influences you. And we are only able to address these kind of differences when we are aware of where we're coming from and also aware of where your spouse or your partner is coming from. And then we will be able to address the potential differences.
Thanks, Cheng. We've got a couple of more minutes, and so if participants have other questions, I'm sure both Cheng and Vincent are happy to answer that. There's a specific question to you, Vincent, but I'm sure Cheng can answer that too. I think this is based on what you just mentioned just now about how, as people, we should be looking at people in terms of our shared humanity. However, I think the question is asking, when people and society at large looks at people, what characteristics and criteria do we look at? But the tendencies still come down to looking at what a person has done or has achieved. The fact is, I guess from this question, I guess there's a kind of cultural norm here about looking at individuals based on their performance. Is it something that can be shifted? Despite the fact that we talk about this need to gravitate towards looking at people in terms of their shared humanity. So do we need a major cultural shift here in terms of our values of how we look at people, view people?
It's almost instinctive, it's ingrained. It's very hard to look at a person, I mean, when we go to a dinner party, the first question that people ask is, what do you do, right? So the entire definition of personhood is wrapped up in what you do, where do you stand in the hierarchy, and people are trying to assess where to place you and so on. I'm sure these things are important to some extent, because you do need, I mean, we need to get things done, and to say that these things do not matter would in fact be naive, right? But I think even as we build hierarchies, we should also every now and then remember that we have a shared humanity, right? Because when we begin to think in that way, then we won't say, we are of different rank and so on, and it's just not possible for us to mix. I mean, it is the research actually suggests, right, that particularly in meritocracies, that high status groups are especially likely to look down on low status groups. Now, why is that so? Because the ideology of meritocracy, E+A, right? The rewards that you get are a function of your efforts and your abilities, right? So whatever station you end up in, it is assumed that that is what you deserve. Because if the ideology says that rewards are given based on efforts and abilities, then where you are would be what you have deserved in a sense, right? Based on the ideology, right? So we need to now and then take a hold of ourselves, I suppose, right? And remind ourselves that even as we build hierarchies, we have to remember our shared humanity and our personhood. We have to adopt a full, we cannot have partial lives, right? Partial lives, you're just an economic machine. That's a partial approach. But we are full human beings in a sense, right? So we work, yes, but we also have leisure. There's so much more to our lives than our rank, so much more to our lives than what we do at work. I mean, the very discussion of work-life balance now isn't that, a commentary on that.
Cheng, any of your thoughts on this topic?
Just to add on to Vincent's sharing that from what I learned about hierarchy, I think usually it is produced in the very beginning for good. Usually that is to make maybe an organization or a society to function more efficiently or to function more effectively to begin with. But when the hierarchy becomes rigid or fixated, usually we start to see the downsides. So I don't think hierarchy by itself is sinful, but if there is no possibility for social mobility, then that is problematic. So I think the society needs to think about when we try to make our hierarchy sustainable, what would be something that needs to be done in the same time in order to assure social mobility for people who are willing to climb up, has sufficient opportunity for that.
I fully agree with what Cheng has said. Yeah. There's the debate now about taxing the wealth and so on. I'm not sure how much that actually helps in the grand scheme of things. It may quell the politics of envy to some extent, but as for how much it really helps, I think what's more important is to lift the base. Right? A lot of social mobility, a lot of flux, going on, and people are able to come up. Then these hierarchies begin to be attenuated because there are pathways going up. Right?
And do you see any implication with the kind of hierarchies? I mean, I assume it's not as ossified here as in some other places, but still it's there. And the people are measured by what they do, often more than the shared humanity. Or, I mean, since that's something that's really valued here, it's a lot of what you do. Then, of course, then the potential to disagree, or, I mean, very, very different views in terms of how society should shape up. We've got different views, right? So we've got a more elite view, we've got the more commoner type of view. And these views, I mean, based on these contexts, especially if individuals are valued based on what they do and their power, then of course society moves towards more of an elite view in terms of what definitions are important, what is valued in society. And essentially then you have a very, very substantial amount of disagreement that comes with that, but a disagreement that comes from a base which may not be able to be articulated in the same ways. I was just, I mean, these are some thoughts going through my mind. I'm just thinking whether you can add anything else to that, or...
I would say this, that class tribalisms is actually one of the hardest inequalities to deal with. I will cite a study I'm familiar with by Olin Wright and Chua. I think it was a paper written in 1992, where he made a comparison of 4 countries, right? So US, Canada, Sweden, and Norway. And what the study actually found, right, was that the amount of class segregation in all 4 societies, different as they may be, were quite similar. So this suggests to us that class segregation and the lack of social mixing on class, and the fact that we tend to gravitate towards our own class groups, is quite intractable, happening across a wide range of societies, notwithstanding the fact that these societies are quite different. Some are, have starker hierarchies, and some are more redistributive. So that's my first comment. My second comment is, that doesn't mean then we should just pack our bags and say, okay, let's give up. I suppose what we need to do is to really lift the base as much as we can, so that the pathways going up are not obstructed in any way. We're not saying that people cannot be rich, because the purpose of meritocracy is to engender that to some extent, because we want to motivate people to aspire to be the best of what they can be. But the need to lift the base, instead of chopping the top copy, to lift the base, I think that's very important.
Thanks, Vincent, for that. Cheng, your last thoughts as we close this panel, anything that you feel that you want to share as we end this discussion on disagreement?
To follow up on Vincent's sharing, I think as a cultural psychologist, I would say that usually it takes quite a lot of time to generate the culture for a society. It might take even more time to change the culture. So even when there are reflections about how we should change or improve the society, no matter if that is about the social structure or the policies, but we have to bear in mind that actually it takes time for people to be able to change their cultural habits and also their cultural understanding. So we need to be very, very patient and also tolerant to the whole process in order to make this change happening. And usually, if we are too eager to pursue too much of the change, then maybe we will see more negative sides than the positives. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Cheng, and thank you, Vincent, for sharing very important nuggets and ideas from your research. And really gives us a perspective on difference in terms of what would be needed to bridge some of those gaps. Thank you very much again.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mathew.
Thanks, Mathew. Thank you, Vincent.
Thank you, Dr. Mathews, and thank you, panelists. Before we begin our closing panel, the grand finale of our conference, we will now take a 20-minute break. You will not want to miss the closing panel, so please be back by 3:25 p.m. Thank you.